I worshipped my grandfather growing up as he was such a strong presence in my life. Even into his later years he could remember conversations he had with people almost 20 years ago. I learned from my mother that he was a passenger aboard the Titanic but refused to ever speak of it with people. I had become obsessed with the story of the sinking as I wanted to do a presentation on it for my school. My grandfather raised his voice at me for the first time in his life after I begged him to tell me the story. He scolded me and I was frightened as I had never seen him act like this. I went to my bedroom and started weeping as I was just so freaked out by what had happened. He came into my room and apologized for the way he acted. I could see the regret on his face as I flinched back from him when he tried to hug me. The next morning I walked downstairs to find him sitting at the table with a look of sadness on his face. He asked me to sit down and I reluctantly agreed. His face had conflicting emotions as he told me that he would tell me what actually happened on the Titanic. He made me promise never to tell anyone as he was worried people might think he was crazy. I sat there dumbfounded as he started telling the story. I was only 7 years old when I climbed on board the Titanic. It seemed so gigantic compared to me and I was struck by how beautiful everything looked. There were so many people everywhere and they were all so friendly and smiling. I stood at the edge of the ship and waved down at the people on the dock as we prepared to set sail. It was one of the happiest moments in my life as I had never felt such exhilaration. My parents ushered me to my room when we were underway as they wanted to enjoy the ship. I knew we had spent most of our money to get tickets as my parents have always wanted to live in America. I began to notice some strange behavior from some of the other passengers in the second day of the cruise. They seemed to be coughing a lot and their eyes were very red. My father assured me that it was nothing, but I can remember how frightened he looked. He left for a few minutes and came back carrying a wrench and told me it was just for protection. I was awoken the next morning by screams coming from the next room. I jumped out of bed and rushed to see what was happening. There was already a group of people standing outside the door and I pushed them out of the way to get a better view. I froze while staring at the contents of the room. There was a man lying on the floor with his stomach ripped open while his 2 young children seemed to be feasting on his intestines. I was shoved out of the way as 2 of the crew rushed in. They grabbed the children and struggled to hold them as the children were like rabid animals. They managed to subdue the children by knocking them out cold. We were ushered back to our rooms so that they could clean up the mess. I wandered the ship for the day and noticed that a lot of people seemed to be very sick. The crew seemed to be very on edge and were always looking around them. I was awoken on the 4th day by screams and running from outside the cabin. I peeked outside and was shocked as the hallway was covered in blood. I quickly closed the door and went to wake my parents, but they weren't here. I didn't know what to do as I was afraid to leave the room but was afraid to be by myself. I spent a couple of hours trying to decide what to do. My rumbling stomach finally convinced me that I needed to leave and find some food. Half the day had already gone and I had just sat here. I crept to the door and peeked out and was relieved to find the hall empty. There were distant sounds of the engines rumbling and the occasional scream. I remembered that there was a kitchen down the hallway which would probably have something in it I could eat. It took an eternity for me to move down the corridor as I was trying to avoid stepping in blood or blood-stained clothes. I reached the kitchen and almost puked while gazing at the corpses inside. They looked like someone had stabbed them hundreds of times. They appeared to be a mixture of crew members and passengers. I grabbed any food that was close at hand and fled. I quickly ate the food that I had acquired and began to search the ship. I kept coming across more corpses along each corridor. Many of them looked like they had their stomachs ripped open. It was beginning to get dark and I was starting to get worried that everyone else on board was dead. I rounded a corner and my bladder let loose as a gun was pointed in my face. I stood there shaking as one of the crew gazed at me for a few moments. He put the gun away before rushing off and leaving me standing there alone. It took me a while to gather my senses and by this time it was completely dark. I had heard distant gunshots in the direction the crew member had run and wondered what he had shot. I was thrown to my feet as a deafening crash rocked the ship. I ran to the side and gazed out at an enormous lump of ice which we must have crashed into. Lumps of ice began to crash down beside me and I had to move away to avoid being hit. I watched the piece of ice disappear off into the distance and wondered how bad the damage was. I heard a noise behind me and was instantly relieved to see my father. I began rushing towards him but stopped after seeing his clothes were covered in blood. His eyes locked on mine and I began to shrink back as his gaze was that of an animal and not a human. He let out a guttural growl and then began to charge at me. I felt my bladder release once again as I awaited my death. My father suddenly went flying backwards and I turned around to discover the same crew member from earlier still clutching the gun. He looked at me for a few moments and indicated me to follow him. He was moving very quickly and I was barely able to keep pace. He was peeking around every corner and we walked by dozens of corpses. We eventually reached an area with a large number of survivors. Some were attempting to lower the lifeboats while the others were trying to fight off the other passengers who seemed to want to eat them. They managed to get the lifeboats down and slowly began to evacuate any survivors. The ship at this point was slowly starting to sink and it was desperate trying to get as many people to safety as possible. Our lifeboat was moving away from the ship and I could see dozens of the passengers rushing backwards and forwards just attacking each other. The ship had begun to sink beneath the waves and most of the people were at the back of the ship. I turned away as I didn't want to see any more of this. There were sniveling cries from the others on the boat as none of us could understand what had happened. A few hours later other ships arrived and we were rescued. My mother had survived on another lifeboat and we tearfully reunited. My mother was offered a substantial amount of money by the owners of Titanic to never say a word and she agreed. I think most of the survivors would rather have forgotten this had ever happened, so it was accepted by everyone. I remember reading the newspapers afterwards and wondering if anyone would ever know what really happened. I gazed at my grandfather in shock as he finished his story as I couldn't believe what I had just heard. He sat there with a tear rolling down his cheek and then swore me to secrecy. I went to bed that night with the intention of asking him more questions in the morning. My mother found his body the next morning. He had suffered a fatal heart attack during the night. I am posting this now in the hopes of finding others who had family members who survived the Titanic. I really want to know the full story of what happened. After sprinkling Parmesan over the mouth-watering chicken and spinach tortellini I just made, I scraped half the dish into the sink and turned on the garbage disposal with an irritated sigh. I hated having to throw half of it away each time. The only reason I moved into this apartment was because rent was cheaper after I'd lost my job and nearly burned through my meager savings. It definitely wasn't the suffocating ambience and sketchy neighborhood, and it most definitely wasn't the meal prep boxes left daily at my door. I only learned about those when the previous tenant visited me. Lid dropped by the very same day I moved in. After pointing out the leaky corners I should avoid, suggesting affordable roach traps, and teaching me how to lock the window with a broomstick, she mentioned the boxes. I thought she was kidding, but she was dead serious. I had to prepare dinner each day, dump half in the garbage disposal, and eat the rest right away. She seemed so nonchalant about it, but I wasn't. Who was sending them? Why? What would happen if I refused? She had no solid answers. All she knew was what the previous tenant had told her, which is what they were told by the previous tenant, and so on. Origins unknown. Even the landlord had no idea this was going on, and Lydia stressed that I must never tell him. She also stressed that I must never refuse. Why? She said protection, claiming that for as long as she lived here, this apartment was never robbed. Was she seriously insinuating that this stupid requirement protected her? She shrugged and said anything was possible. She didn't question the absurdity of it all, but she did question my reluctance. She assured me that she'd eaten from the boxes every day for the year she lived here, and they were legit. No prank. No poison. No strings attached. Just dump half in the garbage disposal and eat the rest right away. She began listing the various meals she'd prepared, and my empty stomach growled. I hadn't had a decent meal in days, and it didn't take me long before I caved. Now, after a month of delicious food, my unease had ebbed, but not my disdain. After I turned off the garbage disposal, I grabbed the remaining chicken and spinach tortellini and plopped down on the floor, eating my only meal today. Despite licking the plate clean, my stomach still complained, and I glared at the sink. Half a portion wasn't enough, and I was sick of wasting part of a perfectly good meal. One that I'd worked hard on, no less. I was done following these ridiculous rules. Tomorrow, I was going to eat the entire thing. And I did. For the next week, I prepared and ate the whole meal. and nothing happened. I'll admit, I was nervous the first few days, but when the world didn't collapse and the boxes kept coming, I felt pretty clever for being the first to break this ridiculous and wasteful trend. As long as food kept getting delivered right to my door, I was going to eat it. All of it. 8 days later, I realized my actions could have killed me. My bladder woke me up that night, and I shambled to the bathroom. After washing my hands, I made my way back to my sleeping bag, and I frowned at an unusual draft. Before I could figure out where it was coming from, a startling force knocked me to the ground. My heart leapt to my throat, and it probably would have jumped out of my mouth if there wasn't a hand smothering my scream. The stench of sweat filled my lungs as I struggled beneath a bony weight, my panicked thoughts flashing horrifying scenarios through my mind. A sharp hiss for silence pierced my ear as the cold metal of a gun pressed against my temple, and I abided. Trembling face down on the floor, I held my breath, my eyes wide in fearful anticipation as I heard my attacker grunting and rummaging. I turned my gaze to the open window, and I cursed myself for not propping the broomstick properly as I saw it lying on the floor. In no time, the intruder had shoved a filthy rag in my mouth and yanked my arms behind my back, binding them before he lashed my ankles together. Only then did he take his weight off me and flip me over, his sunken eyes wild under a mess of hair. He was definitely on something, and it was frightening. His actions had no hesitation. He came here for something and he wasn't leaving without it. The question was, what? That mystery didn't last long as he demanded to know where I hid my valuables. I stared at him in disbelief. Did he not see the squalor I was living in? I didn't even have furniture. Did he think I had cash stuffed in my frayed sleeping bag? Gold hidden in the rusty oven? Diamonds stashed behind the broken radiator? My baffled silence wasn't the answer he was looking for, and I cried out as he punched me in the face. He lifted his fist again, and I flinched, whimpering through my gag as I nodded towards my meager possessions, my wallet and my phone. He crawled over to them, and I crawled away, tears stinging my eyes as my cheek throbbed to the rhythm of my stuttering heart. I was certain $11.25, and a phone with a cracked screen wouldn't be enough to appease him. He seemed desperate. Desperate enough to kill. I had to save myself before it was too late. As he tore through my wallet in frustration, I made my way to the kitchen, my eyes on the drawers. I just needed a knife to cut through these bonds, and I could make a run for it. Balancing on my knees, I bent over and reached up with my hands, my trembling fingers searching for the handle. Gripping it, I pulled, but it didn't move. This was the worst time for it to stick. I wiggled it as I always do, but my position was less than optimal and the drawer refused to budge. After a particularly forceful yank, I lost my balance and fell with a grunt, and my terrified eyes turned towards the door as the intruder stomped in, gun aimed at me. I screamed and cowered against the cupboards, my heart slamming against my ribcage as the blood drained from my face. And then the blood drained from his face. I followed his petrified gaze, and I screamed even louder as an unholy creature erupted from the sink. It towered over us like a giant furry centipede, pointy legs bristling from its long inky body and spikes jutting out of its mouth. With a lurching motion, looking almost as though it was falling, it descended upon the intruder, silencing his scream with a stab straight through his throat. It didn't silence my screams though, and I continued to shriek through my gag as the monster continued to stab the man, its sharp legs jabbing at him like a macabre typewriter. It was facing away, but that didn't stop the spraying blood from dotting every surface of the kitchen, including me. After a few final jabs, the monster stopped puncturing the intruder, and I watched in horror as it began sliding the mutilated body into its mouth, its legs tapping against the cracked tiles with excitement as though this was its first meal in ages. It devoured its kill the way a snake would, completely whole, and vomit fought my screams as it burned my throat. Once the last of the man disappeared, the creature gulped a few times and began spasming. For a hopeful moment, I thought it was choking and dying, but to my terrified dismay, I realized it was crushing the body within its own as I heard bones snap and grind. Its convulsing stopped, and shock stole my screams as I watched its sharp legs retract into its blood-soaked fur. It now looked more like a giant fluffy caterpillar than a centipede, and my raspy breaths raced to my pulse as I fearfully waited to see what it would do next. I stared in fraught disbelief as the monster began slithering across the floor, lapping up every drop of blood it came across before it stretched itself to reach the counters, walls, and ceiling. It was a lot more coordinated after eating, and that amplified my unease. Soon, only my corner was left, and it turned to me, giving me my first clear view of its face. It wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined pincers, antennas, and compound eyes, but instead I saw a rounded snout, floppy ears, and deep scars where its eyes should be. In any other scenario, it might pass for cute, but right now all it did was reboot my vocal cords as it slithered closer. My muffled screams echoed as I pressed myself against the cupboards, petrified, but it didn't seem to care as it licked up the blood around me. When it began licking me, my heart almost stopped beating right then and there as I was certain I was next on the menu. And then, it nuzzled me. I peeked through my eyelids, gulping, and I frowned in uneasy confusion as it curled up beside me, laying its large head on my lap. Slowly, I allowed my screams to stop, my tense body quivering with adrenaline. It had murdered my attacker, cleaned up the crime scene, and now was snuggling? A knock on the door startled us as my neighbors asked if I was alright, and I gasped, afraid the monster would go after them. To my surprise, it shrank away instead, slithering towards the sink and stretching itself thin before wiggling down the drain. The door crashed open, and my neighbors ran in, the look on their faces matching mine as they saw me bound in the corner quaking with shock. After they freed me and I found my voice, I mentioned the robber, but I gave him a happier ending as I claimed he ran away. As much as the creature terrified me, it saved my life, and I didn't want to get it in trouble. Besides, who'd believe me? Maybe Lydia would. I decided to call her in the morning, but that left me up all night, thinking. Was that creature the thing we'd been feeding all this time? Was Lydia right? Was it here to protect us? Was it too weak to scare off the robber before he attacked me because I'd unintentionally starved it for over a week? And despite all that, did it care for me that much that it didn't eat me, saved my life, and snuggled? I hoped that was the case. The creature didn't seem malevolent towards me, but there were still many unanswered questions and uncertainties and I hoped Lydia could answer them. She couldn't. I didn't mention the monster right away, afraid she'd be clueless and think I was insane. Instead, I asked if she knew what was protecting us and if anything unusual slithered out of the kitchen sink. She said our daily ritual protected us, a modern version of ancient sacrifices to the gods, and then she suggested I ask the landlord to fix my pest issues. I still had no answers. Too poor to leave the apartment, and not willing to tempt fate, I decided to continue dumping half the meal in the garbage disposal. If that creature was going to protect me, I had to stay on its good side. The next day, I carried the box to the kitchen, pinned the recipe to my fridge, and began preparing a spicy salmon pizza, keeping a wary eye on the sink. As I turned to the recipe, running my finger down the instructions, it slipped from beneath the magnet and fell to the floor. This happened every once in a while, but this time, the glossy paper disappeared beneath the fridge. Not willing to stick my hand under there, I grabbed a wire coat hanger, stretched it out, and began fishing. I recovered a medley of cereal crumbs, a fossilized chicken wing, a pen cap, a used car salesman's business card, 2 dead roaches, my recipe, and a strange yellowed paper. Curious, I dusted it off and read it, my eyes expanding with every word. /tilde. December 11, 2013. Dear Tenant. I moved into this apartment to care for my savior. I was a hunter, you see, and I had terminal cancer. I was reckless and I didn't care when death would choose to take me. But Alista cared. She protected me when I challenged a bear, appearing out of the blue and nearly dying herself. No one had ever done for me what she did, and I was moved by her selflessness. Alista got injured and lost her eyesight. She was no longer able to hunt, and I felt responsible. I invited her to live with me. With the last of my savings, I signed up for 10 years of a meal prep program. I know I won't live that long. She may not either, but I still ask you, dear tenant, to continue honoring her. Every evening, prepare the meal and leave it in the cupboard under the sink. Then, go to sleep. The next morning, if the plate is still full, do with it as you wish. If the plate is empty, don't be alarmed. Just continue to honor my savior, and you'll be safe and secure as long as you live here. Dear tenant, This is all I ask of you, fulfilling a grateful man's dying wish. Please don't mention this to anyone, especially not the landlord, but if you end up moving out, please hand this letter to the new tenant. And when the 10 years are up on December 11, 2023, please, my friend, consider renewing. Ailista deserves it. Thank you and be blessed. Callum. /tilde. I put the letter down, stunned. The creature truly was a protector. Ailista. Brought here to be cared for by a man with little time. Callum put a lot of faith in a bunch of strangers, but I guess he didn't have a choice. He could have at least told us what we were dealing with, but maybe he didn't trust we'd have Ailista's best interest at heart. I was surprised we'd all followed the rule despite how cryptic it was. Well, at least until I came along. I looked at the letter again. Would I have been more inclined to abide if I'd received this? I'll never know, because one of the previous tenants misplaced it and passed on the message verbally, the request changing from person to person like a game of telephone until we were feeding Ailista half her intended meal through the garbage disposal. Well, that wasn't going to happen anymore. And I didn't want Ailista to hide anymore either. She saved my life, and I wanted to improve hers. After preparing the spicy salmon pizza, I placed it on the kitchen floor and sat cross-legged in front of it. Working up the courage, I cleared my throat and called out her name. Ailista? A soft gurgle sounded from the drain. Ailista, dinner. Food. Yummy food. I'd never met a creature like Ailista before, and I had no idea how intelligent she was. Come out, it's okay. You don't have to eat in the drain anymore. You can live out here with me. I held my breath as she poked her head out of the sink, her nose sniffing the air. Hey, Ailista. She gurgled again. She seemed to like hearing her name. The one her only friend had given her. Well, now she had another friend. I gestured to the pizza and smiled before I remembered she couldn't see. This pizza is all for you. I looked down with regret. I'm sorry I didn't feed you last week. I'll never do that again. I couldn't help but tense up as she slithered over, her long slender body compressing into a bulbous form as she settled in front of me. This was going to take some getting used to. She smelled like rust and old lettuce, and I hoped she wasn't averse to baths now that she didn't have to hide anymore. Two pointy legs protruded from her fur, and they poked around blindly until they found the plate. I watched in surprise as she split the pizza and slid half over to me, and I pushed it back. No, it's all for you, like Callum wanted. As I said that, my stomach growled, and Ailista chirped in response and slid half towards me again. She picked up a slice and began nibbling, and I smiled, teary-eyed as I reached for my own slice. For the first time ever, I was glad I'd lost my job. And once I get a new one, neither of us will ever go hungry again. / Drawings of Ailista in both her forms. www.reddit.com web link. / sr www.reddit.com web link.